There is a moment, and most people over 60 have had it, where you sit down after a meal and instead of feeling satisfied, you feel heavy, foggy, like your body just absorbed something it didn't know what to do with. You assumed it was the food, or the portion, or maybe just age catching up. But what if that moment, that specific feeling, was your body sending you a signal that almost nobody is trained to read correctly? My name is Dr. Vincent Halberg. I've dedicated 30 years to endocrinology, the study of hormones, metabolism, and the invisible systems that regulate how your body uses energy. I consulted for research institutions across 3 continents. I've reviewed thousands of patient cases, and I'll tell you something that took me years to fully appreciate. The conversation happening around blood sugar today is fundamentally incomplete, and that gap between what people are told and what is actually happening inside their bodies is costing people their health silently, 1 year at a time. What I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes is something I now consider one of the most important clinical observations of my career. It's not a medication. It's not a complex protocol. It's a simple daily practice, grounded in physiology, that most people have never heard connected to blood sugar regulation. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why your doctor has probably never mentioned it. Not because they're hiding something, but because medical training simply doesn't emphasize it. Stay with me. Let me start with something most people believe, and most people believe incorrectly. The common assumption is that high blood sugar is caused by eating too much sugar. And yes, that relationship exists, but it is far too simple an explanation for what is actually a sophisticated biological failure. Because here's what I see repeatedly across decades of clinical practice. Patients with excellent diets, reasonable weight, no obvious risk factors, whose blood sugar is still dysregulated, whose energy still collapses without warning, whose body still resists every effort to stabilize. And when you dig into why, when you look beyond the glucose number itself, you almost always find the same underlying story. The body's ability to respond to its own hormonal signals has been quietly compromised. Now I want to walk you through something. Picture your body's glucose regulation system as a highly coordinated relay. When you eat, glucose enters your bloodstream. Your pancreas detects this and releases insulin. Insulin travels to your cells and signals them to open to absorb that glucose and convert it into usable energy. When this relay runs perfectly, you feel sharp after a meal, sustained, energized. But when any part of that relay is disrupted, when the signal is weak, when the cells don't respond, when the pancreas has to send the signal over and over before anything happens, the entire system starts producing outcomes you feel in your daily life. Fatigue that comes out of nowhere, a craving for something sweet in the early afternoon, a mental fog that settles in around 3 o'clock and refuses to lift, weight that accumulates around the midsection regardless of what you do. These are not random inconveniences. These are the downstream effects of a relay that has started to break down. And here's the critical question, the one I've spent 30 years trying to answer precisely. What causes that breakdown to begin? What is the initiating factor? Because if you can identify the origin point, you can interrupt the progression before it becomes irreversible. And this is where I need to tell you about something that most people in this conversation never mention. Something hiding in plain sight inside your own physiology. Magnesium, not as a supplement trend, not as something you take for sleep or soreness, but as a fundamental operating requirement for glucose metabolism itself. Here's the biochemistry, explained simply. Every time insulin attempts to bind to a receptor on the surface of your cells, every time it tries to deliver that signal to open and absorb glucose, that process requires magnesium as an intracellular cofactor. Without adequate magnesium inside the cell, the receptor doesn't respond with full efficiency. The signal gets through, but weakly, partially, like trying to unlock a door with a key that almost fits. The pancreas, sensing that glucose is still circulating, responds by producing more insulin, more and more, until the entire system is running at excessive effort to produce a result that should have required minimal work. This is not a theory. This is documented in peer-reviewed endocrinological literature, and yet it is almost never the first conversation in a clinical setting. Here is what makes this even more striking. Magnesium deficiency is not rare. It is not something that affects a small, identifiable population. Epidemiological data consistently shows that somewhere between 60 and 80% of adults in developed countries are not meeting their body's magnesium requirements. 60 to 80%. Think about what that means. It means that the majority of people experiencing unexplained fatigue, blood sugar irregularity, weight resistance, and afternoon energy crashes may be experiencing those things because of a deficiency so widespread it has become normalized. We've stopped recognizing it as a deficiency because almost everyone has it. And here's the part that I find most clinically significant. Magnesium deficiency does not announce itself dramatically. It doesn't cause a crisis. It doesn't send you to the emergency room. It creates a slow, persistent decline in the efficiency of multiple systems simultaneously: metabolic, neurological, cardiovascular. You feel a little more tired than you used to, a little harder to concentrate, a little more dependent on caffeine in the morning, a little more prone to waking at 3 in the morning, unable to fall back asleep. Each of these individually seems manageable, explainable, but together they form a pattern, and that pattern, in my experience, almost always has magnesium at its center. I want to tell you about a specific type of patient I see frequently. Not elderly, not dramatically ill. Someone in their late 50s or early 60s, reasonably active, eating a diet they consider healthy. Their annual blood work comes back, and their fasting glucose is slightly elevated, not diabetic, but trending. Their doctor says, watch it. The patient goes home, cuts carbs, walks more. 6 months later, the number is the same, or slightly higher. They feel like they're doing everything right, and the body isn't cooperating. This is the patient I find most heartbreaking to see, because they're trying, they're engaged, they just don't have the full picture. And the missing piece, almost without exception, is that nobody has assessed their intracellular magnesium. Nobody has asked whether their cells actually have what they need to respond to insulin correctly. The effort is there. The mechanism is broken. And fixing the mechanism doesn't require more effort. It requires the right information. I've seen patients in this situation implement a focused magnesium replenishment protocol, using highly bioavailable forms that actually reach the cells rather than simply passing through, and within weeks begin reporting things they hadn't experienced in years. Stable energy through the afternoon, better sleep, reduced cravings for sweet or starchy foods. Because when glucose metabolism works correctly, the body stops sending desperate hunger signals. And in many cases, meaningful improvements in fasting glucose readings at their next lab appointment. Not because magnesium is magic, but because the body was never broken. It was depleted, and depleted systems, when given what they need, have a remarkable ability to restore themselves. I want to address something directly. You might be wondering, if this is so well documented, why isn't every endocrinologist talking about it? And I think that's a fair question. The honest answer is that medicine, by its structure, is oriented toward pharmacological intervention. When a number is out of range, the training says treat the number. It doesn't always say, ask why the number got there. Nutritional biochemistry rarely receives the same clinical emphasis as pharmacology, even when the evidence base is substantial. I'm not criticizing my colleagues. I'm describing a system, and I'm telling you that within that system, magnesium falls through cracks, not because it's ineffective, but because it doesn't fit neatly into the prescribe and monitor model that dominates clinical practice. This is precisely why I'm committed to sharing this information in formats like this one, because the patients who benefit most are the ones who come in already understanding their own biology, who ask better questions, who don't simply accept "watch your diet" as a complete answer. Knowledge changes outcomes. And the knowledge that your body's glucose regulation is critically dependent on a mineral that 70% of people are deficient in, that is knowledge worth having. Now, I need to say something with the same directness I'd use with a patient sitting in my office. The body's capacity to restore metabolic balance is real, but it is not permanent. It is not equally available at every stage of life. The pancreatic beta cells responsible for insulin production have a finite reserve. Year after year of compensating for insulin resistance gradually depletes that reserve. The cells that were once able to produce 5 times the necessary insulin to compensate for receptor insensitivity, Those same cells, a decade later, may only produce twice the necessary amount. And a decade after that, the compensation may no longer be sufficient. This is a trajectory. This is what happens when the underlying issue is not addressed. And this trajectory accelerates in the absence of the nutrients the system needs to repair and maintain itself. There's a natural support formulation I want to make you aware of, one built around bioavailable magnesium and complementary compounds that work together to support the kind of metabolic signaling we've been discussing today. It is not a pharmaceutical. It is not a cure. It is nutritional support for a system that, in most people over 60, is working much harder than it should be with far fewer resources than it needs. The link is in the description below and pinned in the first comment. If anything in this video reflected what you've been experiencing, the fatigue, the cravings, the weight that won't shift, the blood sugar that doesn't respond the way it should, then I want you to look at that link today. Not because I'm asking you to buy something, but because understanding your options is the first step toward making a decision that could genuinely change your trajectory. Let me be direct about timing. The question is never whether you should address metabolic health. The question is always when. And the answer, from a purely physiological standpoint, is always earlier is better. Every year the body compensates without support is a year the system moves incrementally closer to a point where correction becomes significantly harder. The people I see make the most meaningful recoveries are not the ones who waited for a diagnosis. They're the ones who noticed a pattern, asked a better question, and acted while their body still had the flexibility to respond. That person can be you. That window is still open. But windows, in biology as in life, do not stay open indefinitely. The link is below. The information is there. I encourage you to read it carefully and make the decision that your future self will thank you for. I'm Dr. Vincent Halberg. Thank you for trusting me with your time today. Use it well.